Hello, I'm Ben Orchard.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick.
Welcome to Sword, Sorcery and Synthesizers, the 80s fantasy movie podcast. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm in Brisbane.
But through the wonders of modern technology and the magic of Skype, we meet each week to discuss some beloved movie of a bygone era and see what lies behind the nostalgia. I've been thinking about Labyrinth, the 1986 film by Jim Henson. This is a film that I've sort of carried a nostalgic torch for around 26 years, actually. More than half my life.
Yeah, ages.
And it stuck with me despite all its imperfections, of which there are quite a few, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. Whereas this is a film that you have seen twice, both times as an adult. What I thought would be interesting is if we played it this way. I tell you the top 5 reasons why I've been carrying a torch for Labyrinth all these years. And as we go through it point by point, you can tell me if this still holds up or if my brain is clouded with the delusional fog of nostalgia.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. I think before we get started on that, though, I'd like to talk a bit about the nature of my nostalgia for this movie, because it's not what you might think. I didn't see this movie as a young child. I was sort of brought up on Sesame Street and the Muppets and some of Jim Henson's more sort of juvenile creations. But I didn't see Labyrinth until I was 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And I was quite a troubled teenager. I was very insecure. I wasn't good at sports, and I was into a lot of, geeky things like sci-fi and fantasy. I was an avid reader. I was very bookish.
Oh, no.
I had this sort of introverted personality. And as a 16-year-old, I was very insecure about the prospect of growing up. I still had a strong attachment to many of the cultural artifacts of childhood, the stories, the songs, etc. I guess a part of me felt this odd sense of melancholy about leaving all that behind as I had to, face the big bad world and move out and get a job, all of that.
Mm-hmm. The real world outside fantasy stories and childlike wonder.
Yeah, pretty much. And also as a teenager, I must confess that I was expected to do more around the house. During my early childhood years, my dad worked and my mum stayed at home, but my mum, got another job in my teenage years, and I was expected to do more and take on more responsibility as I could stay home and do things by myself. I didn't have to be supervised all the time. I could look out for my little brother. And I didn't always take to these new responsibilities, these new chores with grace. At times I was, very angsty and petulant. I have to confess, I wasn't the easiest teenager to be around.
You were homeschooled for a part of your education, weren't you?
Yeah, year 8 to year 10 of high school, I was at a normal public school. But from year 11 and 12, I did through homeschooling.
Mm.
I was living in a very remote area. I was living in a place called Christmas Island at the time. My family just couldn't afford to send me to a boarding school. But by that time, I'd sort of gotten over a lot of the angst I was talking about.
Mm. I mean, going through puberty and anything like that. My younger daughter, she's 12 this year. She's going through puberty and angst and things like that. So, And as we kind of, grow, we mature. Yeah, sounds like a normal teenage life.
In any case, the reason I mentioned this is because one rainy Sunday afternoon, I was switching through the channels on the television and Labyrinth came on TV. And the titles just jumped out at me, the credit sequence, all the names there, the mixture of different names that I was familiar with, the Jim Henson, the master puppeteer, but also the screenwriter Terry Jones of Monty Python fame. And I was a big fan of Monty Python from all the times that the ABC network here in Australia would rerun their shows in the afternoon. And my parents were big Monty Python fans. And David Bowie as well. I actually loved a lot of his 80s pop stuff. That was like the soundtrack to my childhood. So when I was flicking through the channels and I saw the credits for this movie, it's like, Henson, Bowie, Jones, I'm there. But what I didn't expect was that I would feel such a close identification with the heroine of this story, Sarah, who seemed to be going through so much of the same feelings that I was in terms of, struggling with adolescence, the transition from childhood to adulthood, and also trying to balance out her creative side with her responsibilities to her family. Mm-hmm. And, trying to decide as she grows up what childish things should be put aside, what she can retain and still remain, a mentally healthy adult.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can resonate with that. We all go through our, puberty, that changing hormones and emotions, and we struggle to understand ourselves at that age because we're on that cusp of adulthood, but not quite there yet. But I think also you being homeschooled and, in a remote setting, that would have probably added to, some issues that Sophie would have had, just speculating here. But I, face my own, I guess, issues through adolescence as well. But it's probably for you and me a combination of reasons that led us to really getting into fantasy and the performance of escapism, which this movie is.
I must admit that there were times when I used fantasy fiction as a crutch, as a kind of psychological crutch to just switch off from the world and disengage or disassociate from the bullying I was receiving at school or the struggles I was having with connecting to my peers on an emotional level.
Yeah.
And I just sort of, tuned out. And there were times during my adolescence where I guess I leant too heavily on that crutch of fantasy, of diving into the world of fiction, of movies, novels, of rock music, and just not engaging with the world as much as I should have. And this is something that sometimes led to arguments in my family. It's not a one-to-one ratio of me and Sarah. My parents were quite happily married. And even though I had my differences with my little brother from time to time, we usually got along. And it probably helped that there wasn't as big an age gap as there is between Sarah and her brother Toby in the movie. He's she's 16 and he's a baby.
So I often think about that and compare it to my own children. My youngest, who is one, was 1 in July, and my oldest, who is 12 in November. They don't really get along. She doesn't really like it. She's like, "Why did you have a baby? You're old." So I guess maybe I can, understand from a parent's perspective that it would be difficult to sort of interact with the younger sibling, especially if there's an age gap like that.
Sure. And I guess with Labyrinth, ultimately, I found the message of the film comforting. And I think that's why seeing it when I did at this vulnerable time of my life, it sort of stuck with me, and it's become a kind of comfort food piece of cinema for me, is because I took comfort in the ultimate message of the film that growing up does not mean you have to put aside all the childish things.
Yeah.
You just have to be mindful of your responsibilities and not take, the ones you love, the people who love you, for granted.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually quite a healthy, nuanced message.
Yeah.
It's one that perhaps many more successful 80s fantasy films don't have.
I think makes it completely different, but it just the book and movie Matilda just popped into my head, as Matilda read a lot because found this engagement from home, and then obviously she sort of matured a little more because she was reading such classics as Moby Dick, as she spoke about. So again, fictional character, but it just made me think of just why people read and what people get out of it as that sense of companionship with characters who can almost seem real at times. That's certainly how I felt as like a friend when I couldn't find friends in my real life.
Well, I talked to you in our first episode, the one about Never-Ending Story, the parallels I saw between myself and Bastian as a young boy. Yeah. I think I saw many parallels between myself and Sarah as an adolescent, as a teenager. And, okay, I know a lot of female fans of Labyrinth talk about how fetching David Bowie is in those skin-tight pants that show off his package very well. And the fact that, like, Bowie at the time was still something of an unconventional sex symbol. Let's say maybe a hipster sex symbol. I don't know. Is it creepy of me to say that when I watched Labyrinth aged 16, I found Jennifer Connelly, who was also 16 in this movie, just exquisitely beautiful, especially in that princess ball gown that she has in one scene. And so not only was there this character whose emotional struggles I identified with, but I know she was embodied by this actress who was basically, I don't know, the embodiment of my feminine ideal of beauty.
Your dream girl.
If you like, I guess that covers it. Yeah.
That's not weird at all. You're at your adolescence. You're learning who you are and who you're attracted to, and it can also lead to the type of woman that you eventually kind of be with. I think you did mention your long-term partner has similar attributes to a lot of the fantasy characters that you really like.
Well, my long-term partner is a brunette and she has green eyes.
Yeah.
Which, now that I think about it, Connolly has a similar appearance. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, by the way.
Well, into brunettes, that's what I'm saying.
But yes, I mean, of course, Jennifer Connelly has matured both as a woman and as an actress, and these days I'm not so much drawn to her in this movie as, the more mature roles she's had in films such as The Rocketeer and Dark City and Creation, and her beauty has matured like a fine wine with age, and so does her acting ability, I should say. I mean, she won an Oscar for A Beautiful Mind, and she's still got it. I recently saw her in Top Gun Maverick, and a surprisingly nuanced performance in such a silly popcorn movie as that is, and still looking amazing in 50-something or whatever she is.
Well, I recently saw her in Snowpiercer, the TV series, which I'm a very big fan of. I was a fan of the movie and fan of the series, and I thought she was awesome. I was like, "You go, girl, you're looking good." That's for your age. I was like, "Don't you?"
But I want you to know, Claire, that there is more to my enduring love for this film than just raging hormones. And I'd like to go into that.
Yeah, of course.
So, okay, the top 5 things that really, appeal to me about Labyrinth, in random order. First of all, just on a shallow surface level, there's just the incredible attention to detail in the props, sets, and costumes. This is such a visually rich world.
Yeah.
Like, every time I watch the movie, I see some small detail in the background that, look, either I don't remember having seen it before, or like it's something new that I've noticed. And I've seen this movie more times than I can count over the course of the 20 plus years I've seen it. Every time I sit down to watch it, I keep thinking, wow, there's that little detail of the architecture or the costumes or something else I didn't notice in the background. And I'm like, wow. And there are times like I actually want to pause the movie just to like look a bit closer at the background detail.
I don't think it's shallow at all. I think that's something that you discover repeat watching of some of your favorite movies, because you grow closer with it over time, and it's something that you really treasure. So, and on each watch, you do notice the things. I do the same thing. Like I notice, the sets, the props, and just the nuanced ways that the actors portray the characters. You notice that over time, and I think you appreciate these things more.
Okay, but you've seen Labyrinth twice, both times as an adult. Did you find the visual world that was crafted for this movie as enchanting as I did?
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. Obviously, because I've spoken about it before, like I've gone on and on about it. But I thought it was excellent. I thought it was just really rich. And I've mentioned before that I love the use of color in films, especially horror films. But I found the use of color in this like awesome. And I thought it was a really cool fantasy world. So I loved it.
The second thing that I love about this movie, and that is the energy and the life that Jim Henson and his team of puppeteers infuse into these characters, these puppets.
Yeah.
We were talking in the previous episodes that we did on The Never-Ending Story and Conan the Barbarian, how some of the creature effects in those two films look a bit stiff. The movement of their lips isn't quite in sync with their voices some of the time.
Yeah.
But that isn't the case in Labyrinth. The puppets have such energy to them. I mean, they never look completely lifelike, but because they have that energy, you soon forget that you're seeing a puppet on screen, I think.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really liked about it, because I found it was executed really well. So it seemed the puppets seamlessly were in the movie and acted alongside, the human actors. Suppose puppets acting. They were used very seamlessly, very well done alongside, the human actors, which I thought was really, really cool. Didn't seem stiff or anything like that.
Well, that's another aspect that perhaps gets overlooked, is the choreography in this movie that you just mentioned, and the way that the choreography of the puppets is integrated with the choreography of the actors, the human actors.
Yeah.
And it's all quite seamless. And interestingly enough, one of the choreographers on this movie was a woman named Cheryl McFadden. She's better known as an actress under the name Gates McFadden. She played Dr. Beverly Crusher in Star Trek: The Next Generation. She's earned a measure of like geek immortality for that. But yeah, she did the choreography for this movie. Any Trekkers out there listening to this who are fans of hers, you can check it. That's another reason to check out Labyrinth. The choreography she does in this movie is really quite amazing.
I was reading about the people who obviously brought to life the puppets and characters. I think with Brian Henson, who was Jim Henson's son, who did the voice for Hoggle, doing the mouth puppetry. But one of the things I was looking into and thought was interesting, that there are more than one performer who actually brought these kind of characters to life, worked on Hoggle. I think there were 5 or 6 puppeteers, I'm not quite sure. Someone who was like inside the costume, I think.
I haven't actually looked up all the names.
Yeah.
I can tell you that you're right about Brian Henson and Hoggle. But yes, a lot of these puppets some people were doing the voices, some people were doing the movements. Sometimes they had like multiple puppets for the same character for certain sequences, depending on what they wanted them to do. Although you wouldn't think to look at them. I mean, it all seems like one consistent thing once it all comes together.
Yeah. I'm assuming also there was someone else doing like the animatronics and the movement as well. I haven't looked that up, but if so, having multiple people controlling one character, maybe someone might think it wouldn't work because it's just, too many people. But I think it's done really well, and employing that use of puppetry seems to be a really great way to make sure the character is as realistic and lifelike as possible. The movements aren't stiff and things like that.
I think what probably happened, like the reason for that, is because they could have one person controlling, say, the lip movements of the character, and another person controlling their hand movements or body movements or whatever, which would be very difficult for one puppeteer to do successfully all on their own. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. It's kind of challenging. And maybe that was the key to why Henson's puppetry seemed a lot more like energetic and lifelike than some of his contemporaries at the time. I mean, no disrespect intended to Neverending Story and Conan the Barbarian, both of which are favorites of mine, as anyone can tell from listening to my gushing summary of them on our previous podcast episodes. But I think watching them and then watching Labyrinth, I begin to realize why Henson was so celebrated in his lifetime. Because I must admit that growing up with Sesame Street and growing up with, I guess, a lot of 90s films that took the techniques he had pioneered and took them a step further, I kind of, took this kind of thing for granted in a lot of the media growing up, and I didn't understand why he was so celebrated when he was alive. I think I understand a bit better now, reflecting upon it for this project.
Yeah, and being an adult, and obviously you being in a community theatre, which is just theatre in general, you understand that there are so many people who make a show. There are so many people who contribute to running successfully. So obviously, Jim Henson's success is an attribute to just how good he was. And just how much work and dedication he put into it.
I think that the lavish production design combined with the energetic puppetry, the lifelike puppetry, it just creates such a visually rich escapist world.
Yeah.
You just put on this movie and you lose yourself in another world. It's a feast for the eyes, every single frame. There's frames in this movie where you could just pause the movie and you could take a screen cap of that and it could be a postcard or something. It's that good, even though some of the special effects work hasn't aged well. A lot of the blue screen compositing, I'm probably using the wrong terminology here, but it's more obvious, especially if you're watching it on a high definition television. Not all of the effects have held up, but I think the energy of the performance sort of carries the day, even despite these things.
Well, that's something that I think obviously makes movies better. So let's say there might have been some flaws in something, but just the energy, just how much the actors put into the movie, the characters, tends to make it so much better than it could be.
I think that's a good segue to talking about the third reason that I've held a torch for this.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the delectable ham and cheese toasted sandwich that is the human stars, that Jennifer Connelly and David Bowie. He's the ham, she's the cheese, obviously, in this.
I mean,
this labored metaphor.
Yeah.
No, seriously, the two human stars of this movie are as much a key to its appeal to me as the puppetry is.
Yeah.
And before I get to Bowie, who's a legend, obviously, I'll just briefly mention Connelly again, because I know a common criticism of her acting in this film is that she doesn't show sufficient wonderment, the surroundings, the fantastical surroundings that she's in. And Connolly herself has said in interviews that basically there were times she felt overwhelmed by the lavish, production values around her, and she could have given more. But I don't know. I feel that there's hints in this movie scattered throughout, although her performance isn't perfect. I think there's hints of the sort of Oscar-winning actress she'd become. I think her comic timing's very good in all the scenes where Sarah is trying to apply like reasonable logic to some of the puzzles that she encounters in the labyrinth and some of the argumentative characters that she meets. Especially the scene with the talking doors, and one of them always tells the truth and one of them always lies. And also the scene where she's crossing the bridge that's guarded by the like little talking terrier things, the Didymus.
I really understood that being a younger actress, she's still learning. They're still like child actors, teenage actors are still learning, as I said, who they are as a person. They're still learning how to act. They're still learning how to interact with adults. They're still learning how to take directions. So when I watched it a few more times, I thought, actually, like, she's really good for like all the effort she's putting into it. And
well, I thought also I mentioned the comedy scenes. I thought that there was also some pathos towards the end where she's looking in the mirror and she confesses that she's always going to need her childhood friends. There's going to be a part of her that's still connected to her childhood even as she grows up. And I thought, oh, that's actually very touching and that's actually well played. I recently watched a documentary on Jim Henson that's on Disney Plus called Ideas Man. And it's quite interesting. It not only goes into details of his meticulous pioneering techniques, but also his flaws as a human being. Mainly that, like, he would get so wrapped up in his work, he sometimes neglected his family. But one of the things that they mentioned was that he had such a relaxed, easygoing personality. He hardly ever raised his voice, and he didn't really push back against the people that he worked with that much. And although those qualities might, make you, a great guy to sit down and have a beer with, those are not necessarily good qualities for a director to have. And that might be part of why, his career as a film director as opposed to a puppeteer didn't really take off. Because there are times as a director you do have to be more assertive. You do have to put your foot down a bit.
Yeah.
And if there are times when perhaps he could have said to Connolly, give a bit more. Perhaps there were also times he could have said to David Bowie, dial it down a bit. Like you're going a bit over the top here. So as much as, although this is the thing, I feel that I'm gonna give a defense of what, and this might seem like a really lame defense. I'm gonna give a defense of what some people see as the stiffness of Connolly's acting during the early parts of the movie. I tend to think of the Labyrinth as being a dream sequence or an extended fantasy that the character of Sarah is having, rather than a real place that she's going to. And a lot of the time when I'm having a dream that is totally fantastical, when I wake up and I think about it, in the moment, when in the dream, I'm actually calmly accepting of the situation. And I guess I feel that, Connolly acting oddly calm and nonchalant at certain points, even cheerful and chipper at other odd moments in the early stages of the movie, actually captures like the dream-like nature of dreams. Yeah, they're like, oh, this is just normal. I'm in a shape-shifting labyrinth where like rocks can move, things like that. That's my defense. It might be a lame one.
No, I think it's actually good. One of the things that I compared the film to and compared Sarah to was Alice in Wonderland. Obviously, like, we know that she's fallen asleep, or, she wakes up and she's listening to her sister read a book and things like that, which, she's laying down on a riverbank and getting tired. Anyway, so a lot of the way she reacts to all the creatures and everything that happens when she falls down a rabbit hole and goes to Wonderland, she just sort of accepts it. She just accepts it all and she's like, oh, okay. All right. That's normal. What's next? And as each person she meets, as strange as it is, yeah, she just thinks, yeah, this is fine. So I actually was thinking about that as I was watching Labyrinth, because I thought, yeah, this is probably what would happen if you're having a dream. You would accept it. You'd be like, this is logical, I guess. So that's one of the reasons I thought, no, this is fine. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. If Connolly is a bit too subdued at times, I would say that David Bowie more than compensates for that. So let's get to him. And
yeah.
I realized that a lot of film critics in contemporary reviews when this film came out were a bit hard on him, saying like he was going really over the top. He was like full on pantomime villain here, and that there is some truth to that. But damn, he is an entertaining pantomime villain.
Oh, I don't. So good, so good.
Okay, the thing that's interesting about Bowie's performance is that he's very sly and sarcastic at some moments, but he's also very theatrical and hammy and over the top at others. And it's not always the moments that you think he'll go over the top that he does.
Yeah.
And there are times when his character is saying something incredibly creepy or incredibly evil, but he says it in a really casual way. There's a moment where he reorders time to make Sarah's quest more difficult, and she petulantly says, "Oh, that's not fair," and he strokes his chin and says, "Like, you keep saying that. I wonder what your basis for comparison is." and the way he delivers that line, he's not delivering it in a mocking or gloating way. He's delivering it as like he honestly can't understand her objections to him making her life so hard. And there's other moments where he's sort of losing his shit over more trivial things that his trivial mistakes his minions are making. It's just a wildly unpredictable performance.
That sort of makes me think of when he says, I asked for so little, just let me rule you. And it's just like, that's so wildly insane to say. And he says that with such calmness. He's like, as if that's normal. And I think that was just kind of hilarious. Like, whether he delivered that based on what he was directed to, or whether he just did it based on just what he thought Jareth would be like. It was just interesting.
Well, underneath all of the campiness, the flamboyant costumes, the over-the-top musical numbers, which I'll get to later, there's a strong undercurrent of creepiness to his performance. I think your quoting of that speech makes me want to get onto my next point in favor of the movie, which is how, as silly as this film sometimes is, and it has this very episodic, thrown together mess of a plot, but it touches upon some hard truths that I think a lot of other more successful 80s fantasy films don't even acknowledge. And getting to that speech where I believe Jareth says, I ask so little of you, just let me rule you, love me, fear me, do as I say, and then I'll give you everything you want. That is the mantra not only of dictators towards their subject. It is also the mantra of your garden variety domestic abusers to the spouse that they're manipulating and keeping under their thumb. It's the same thing whether you're a tyrant who's a dictator or a domestic abuser. And that's the thing. Jareth is a tyrant and he's a predator. And I think that despite all of the theatrics, the sort of campy elements of his character, Bowie successfully conveys this feeling of being a predator, being a tyrant. And I think this is the hard truth that I think Labyrinth acknowledges that a lot of 80s fantasy films don't, is that sometimes, villains can have attractive qualities. And
Yeah.
I mentioned Bowie brings this dark charisma and sex appeal to the table as well. And like Jim Henson's previous fantasy film, The Dark Crystal, had a very black and white system of morality where the heroes were, virtuous and pure-hearted, and the villains were like repulsive, sadistically evil to an extent that was almost comical. Whereas in Labyrinth, and this is what rings true to me as an adult, is that the heroine is a deeply flawed person who is irritating at times, but ultimately still virtuous and fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
Whereas the villain has some attractive qualities. There's this dark charisma, and you can see why he'd be a king. He'd have a following.
Do you think I don't know if it's like appropriate, but like when I was watching it, obviously being an adult, I'm just like, he would be ghost dominating in the bedroom. You're into that. And then I was like, maybe that's why it's so creepy, because he is like interacting with a child. But maybe if the actress or the character was an adult, there'd be this kind of sexiness to it and be like, oh my mom, but not because he was a child. And that's what I find like it's so interesting with, there is a line.
You would not get away with that today. I mean, the fact that Connolly was 16 at the oldest when they made this, and Bowie was in his like late 30s or something. Yeah. But also, and I think it's deliberate. I don't think we're reading too much into this. Yeah. I think that this is all quite deliberate. But it's worth mentioning that it's the villain doing this, and the attraction as it's presented in the movie is pretty one-sided on the villain's part. And it's kind of the villain's job to do things that are morally wrong. Yeah. But that hasn't stopped, like, have you ever been on fanfiction.net? Like Labyrinth has a cult following of people who write fan fiction where Sarah succumbs to Jareth's charms, and it's really, it's even more creepy than what's in the movie.
That's so creepy, yeah. But then, again, if she was an adult, I'd be like, isn't that now? But not as a teenager, not as a child. No.
I think it's people getting mixed up with the appeal of the actors with the characters, and I think it's also perhaps the fact that Connolly has gone on to mature roles, that people forget that she was only 16 when she did this.
Yeah. Also, they were conventionally attractive. Yeah, but they are. So you might want to.
You think David Bowie is conventionally attractive? That's interesting.
Hell yeah. I mean, like, he's big sort of alternative, but like, I don't know, like color cheekbones. I try to figure out, I'll be like, yeah. So I just don't think so.
But seriously though, I think that as I've studied history and I've looked at like real life dictators, and also as I've studied psychology and I've looked into the profile of like abusive people in a domestic situation, I think that a lot of these people do have a charisma to them, and that's what causes people to fall for their lies. Yeah. And I think that's sort of reflected in this character. And the other sort of hard truth that I think Labyrinth acknowledges that a lot of other movies about the power of imagination, like say The Neverending Story, sort of gloss over, is that, I don't know, imagination can be a double-edged sword, and being a creative person can be a double-edged sword. Yeah. And that if having too much imagination in your life can be just as bad as having like not enough. And you've got to strike a balance there. And like, I think in a way watching Labyrinth when I was 16 was a kind of a wake-up call for me, in the sense that like you can't use art as a psychological crutch. You've got to face your problems eventually and own up to your responsibilities. Yeah. But at the same time, acknowledging that doesn't mean you can't have fun. It doesn't mean that you can't be creative. You just have to channel it in a constructive way. And a lot of films I've seen about like the power of imagination, at least like the film version of Neverending Story, presented rather unambiguously as this all positive, fluffy, wonderful thing. I think the moral grey areas of Labyrinth kind of interesting. And I don't think a lot of fantasy films these days would go that far. They'd go that way.
No, like I like mentioned before with Neverending Story again, like there are a lot of themes in it that just don't. Well, there are a lot of themes in current fantasy films that just, aren't that deep. There doesn't really seem to be a real moral kind of lesson to learn. Like it's more, people get whisked to a fantasy land or something, or they save the day and cool. There's like a love interest, awesome. But with films like Labyrinth and even Neverending Story, there is an underlying theme. Perhaps there's also, with a lot of 80s fantasy films, as we've mentioned, those underlying themes are something that made them stand out and made them something that stuck with a lot of people, like yourself. There's a nuance to them, and now, like, save for, outliers, I just don't think that they have that in fantasy films and like anymore.
Well, on a lighter note, I guess that brings me to the fifth thing in my top five. I mentioned the production values, I mentioned the puppetry, I mentioned the acting, the philosophy. But I think on a lighter note, there's Terry Jones's dialogue, which I think often just sparkles and has some real zingers to it. I mentioned that Terry Jones was one part of the comedy troupe Monty Python, who's
hello, yeah.
Well, yeah, and a lot of their skits are very quotable, and people have quoted them out of context endlessly, and they've become memes. And I guess his dialogue for Labyrinth isn't quite on that level, but there's still quite a few quotable gems here that are fun to bring, out of context to parties or something.
Yeah, well, there's what are a few ones I'm thinking of? When Sarah is first entering the labyrinth, she's like, it's hopeless asking you anything. Or with like the worm in the early stages, of going into the labyrinth, it's like, cut inside, meet the missus. And I think, the statue says, I'm just doing my job. So those are things like quotes that I found really stand out. And are really funny and interesting.
Well, yeah, I just keep coming back to like the bridge scene, or most of the sequences where I don't know the ones with the doors that one of them tells the truth and one of them lies, or the stone head in the wall that warns of like certain death, and it's a false alarm, but he's like, oh come on. It's been hundreds of years since I got to utter this line.
Yeah.
Now, when I was talking about my top five, you noticed that there were things I didn't mention. I didn't say something like, I love this movie because it has such a tightly constructed plot. And I didn't say, I love this movie because it has timelessly relevant musical numbers. I didn't say that, Claire.
I wonder why.
Well, look, here's where I have to own up to Labyrinth's flaws. And probably, this is where I realized why it was a flop at the time and why it probably didn't get very good reviews. The screenwriter Terry Jones, his background was in sketch comedy, like I said, with Monty Python. And a lot of his other writing gigs were more collaborative than this one. And the thing is, like, this is a very episodic, skittish plot.
Yeah.
Like it's structured more as like a series of episodes than a, streamlined narrative with a straightforward beginning, middle, and end. So
that's what I thought too. Yeah. There's a lot of the musical numbers come out of nowhere. So random and make no sense. And make no.
They make no sense in context.
Yeah, they make no sense in the context of the movie. Like, one of the things I thought, when Bolly dance magic dance, and I'm like, can Santa hear Jareth singing? Or like, is it just in his kind of world? Like, can she hear it? Like, and why is there like, weird dances that just happen? Is that more to showcase, Bowie's musical talent? Probably.
The story I've heard is that this whole project started when Jim Henson and Brian Froud were like doing drawings and designing creatures, and they started with an idea for the look of the film. Then they took their designs to Terry Jones and said, like, can you write us a screenplay that ties all this together and come up with a story to put all of these, visual marvels into? And he's like, oh, okay, sure, why not? And so he did that. And at some point when the production team were reading through the screenplay, someone said about the character of Jareth, oh, he's got a rock star attitude. And a light bulb went off in Jim Henson's mind. And he just thought, right, I think we should cast a rock star as Jareth. And they considered a few people. I heard that they considered Michael Jackson and Mick Jagger and Sting before settling on David Bowie. And once David Bowie came on board, they were like, well, we've got Bowie, so why not throw in a few songs and just for the hell of it. And the whole movie seemed to be run on the idea of like, let's do what seems cool, what's a good idea, seemed like a good idea at the time. So yeah, the in-story rationalization for like that magic dance number is just, oh, the baby that we've kidnapped, the poor tyke is feeling depressed. Let's sing a number to cheer him up, and then they launch into this pop song. The only song in the movie that I think is vitally tied to the story or character development is the last song that Jareth sings at the end, "Within You," when he's confronting Sarah on this like MC Escher inspired staircase, and it's basically establishing that his power is linked to her belief in him or other people's belief in him, and that ties into sort of like the trickster fae archetype of characters like Rumpelstiltskin or something, or I'm thinking of Peter Pan as well, where like do you believe in fairies and such. But anyway, that's the only thing that's really tied to the story and the characters. The other ones are just sort of like pop songs that seem to be thrown in just because they thought, oh, this is cool. We can get Bowie to do a catchy tune now.
Like, but the thing is, do other people hear them? That's what I think. Sorry. The thing is, do other people hear these songs? Like, who knows? Is this just something that, they just sort of are used to? Oh, yeah, he don't pay attention. He always just breaks into the song. Or is this something that only Sarah can witness, or as the audience we can witness? Yeah, is this normal for him to do? To break into song in promptu moments?
I don't know. Whenever I'm watching a musical, I just think, this is just part of the show's world. I'll just roll with it. And I guess the thing is that, Jareth is not the most rational man around, so it doesn't seem like something. Considering all the other crazy stuff he does, I don't think it's beyond the pale for him to do this. As for whether other people, are aware of this, I didn't really think that deeply about it. I just thought like this is a fun musical number, a fun musical interlude amidst all the other wacky things that are going on. I have to confess that the music of this film is a guilty pleasure for me, as is so much of David Bowie's 80s pop output. A lot of hardcore David Bowie fans I know look down upon the 80s as a low point in his career. They say that he had become too commercial, too mainstream, too sort of his music had become too accessible, and he just stopped taking risks as an artist, and that generally the synthesizer heavy sound of his like 80s pop records combined with lyrics that were just like really inane stream of consciousness stuff a lot of the time just left them feeling cold. Personally, I find his music of this period infectiously catchy.
Yeah.
I don't think he's sold out to the mainstream at all, just because, like, okay, the arrangements are poppy, but the lyrics are just insane a lot of the time, and it could only be Bowie. And okay, and I think it's a testament to what a singularly unique artist he is, that something like Labyrinth represents Bowie at his most mainstream and accessible and commercial period of his career. This, of all things.
Do you know, that makes me think of Kate Bush. You know, a lot of her music, it's interesting to realize that it is commercial, or it did kind of chart. Like, you think of, I don't know, Wuthering Heights. How is it even a song? That's crazy. But that's still, like, it's poppy, you know, people listen to it, they really enjoy it. It's not something that, you know, it's not that accessible. It's so uniquely her. It's so uniquely Kate Bush. With David Bowie, it's so uniquely David Bowie. And that's what I find is so interesting about these musicians, these singers, and perhaps that contributes to the longevity of their success, because they're so unique and so cool.
Well, yeah, if you're going to sell out like David Bowie did in the 80s, I mean, it's so... yeah. I wish more artists sold out like he did. But in all seriousness, though, I agree with you. I think there was an element of theatricality to even the most mainstream of 80s music. That sense of theatricality isn't as prevalent these days, I would say. But and maybe that's, you know, there's good and bad points about that. And like, I don't want to sound like one of those cranky old men, just like who says like, oh, kids these days, their stuff, you know, the stuff they're listening to is not as great as the stuff we had. I don't want to fall into that trap. But I see where you're coming from in the way that like taste change. But
yeah, obviously, you know, with this music and choosing someone like him, you're going to have stuff like this. You're going to have songs like this because he was just so theatrical at that time. And the directors and everything like that, they would have known this. And even people seeing his name on the poster, like in the credits, thinking, okay, there's going to be some kind of over-the-top theatrics to it. I can only assume.
Well, if you see some of David Bowie's other acting work, you might be surprised. I have seen some of his other work, and I can say that he's capable of giving a subtle and nuanced performance when he puts his mind to it. I was impressed by his sort of chilling performance as Pontius Pilate in The Last Temptation of Christ, or his conflicted performance as Nikola Tesla in The Prestige. In both cases, he was sort of barely recognizable, and he was like nicely understated. But yes, I agree. Like, you see David Bowie's face on a poster for a movie, and you expect that it's going to be larger than life.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I think what I like about David Bowie's 80s pop music is, as inane as a lot of it was, and as inane as a lot of the stuff in Labyrinth is that it's just fun. You can tell that he's having a good time. And I feel the fun is infectious to me as a listener.
Yeah, and that's what I can see in Labyrinth, that they're having such fun. And I think that it makes it so whimsical. And despite its flaws, it's just so enjoyable to watch and revisit, because I love seeing that in movies. I love seeing that actors so honestly are having fun. And it doesn't seem like a chore. It doesn't seem like they're making the movie because they ran out of money. They're really having a good time. And I think that really comes across in this movie. It's really cool.
I agree with you, Claire, that sense of fun is a big part of the movie's appeal, despite its cheesiness. And I'll make one more observation, which is, I think what differentiates a classic from a cult classic is that when you hear some cinephile praise to the heavens some classic of cinema like The Godfather, they're usually talking about how it's as close to perfection as a human artistic endeavor can be.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with a cult classic, a lot of the time, the people who love the movie so much are all too aware of its flaws, all too aware of even things that are ridiculous about the film. But in an odd way, they love it as much because of the flaws, rather than in spite of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's the case with something like Labyrinth, where it is cheesy, it is silly, it is incredibly unfocused. But in an odd way, that's part of the appeal. It contributes to the whole vibe of like immersing yourself in this crazy, otherworldly experience.
That's probably why I really like The Lost Boys as well. It's just like, who lives in this town? How is this town real? And it's so weird. But yeah, I think you just sort of accept that it's going to have flaws, but you love it anyway. And it doesn't have to be a guilty pleasure. It's just, this is just cool. This is a really cool movie, which is what I really like about a lot of 80s kind of fantasy movies. You know, they're just fun.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad to hear that we seem to be mostly on the same page here.
Yeah.
And it makes me like feel so much better that, you know, my lingering affection for this is not just delusional nostalgia. But we should do another episode on The Lost Boys sometime in the future, because I really like that movie too, and I agree it has the same mixture of sort of cheesy elements and stylish, like unironically cool elements. And that'd be a great subject for a future podcast episode.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.